The grizzly's roar shattered the mountain silence at dawn, and Jonas Blackwood didn't reach for his rifle because he had already decided this fight would be with cold steel and nerve alone. He had been tracking the massive beast for 3 days through the Rocky Mountains of Colorado Territory, ever since it had torn through a settler's camp near Nederland and dragged off a young calf. The year was 1876, and Jonas had made his living as a mountain man for the better part of a decade, trapping beaver and hunting game in these unforgiving peaks. At 28 years old, his body was carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves, broad shoulders straining against his buckskin shirt, arms thick with muscle from years of swinging axes and hauling traps. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his jaw was set with the kind of determination that came from surviving alone in the wilderness. The bear stood on its hind legs, easily 9 feet tall, its breath steaming in the cold morning air. Jonas had cornered it in a narrow ravine where his rifle would have been cumbersome, nearly useless in close quarters. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath, the blade nearly 12 inches of sharpened steel that had been his companion through countless dangers. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hand was steady. The grizzly dropped to all fours and charged. Jonas waited until the last possible second, then dove to the side, slashing upward as the bear's momentum carried it past. The blade caught the animal's shoulder, drawing first blood. The grizzly wheeled around with shocking speed, but swiping with claws that could have disemboweled a man. Jonas felt the air move as the paw passed inches from his chest. He rolled, came up in a crouch, and moved in again. The fight lasted 7 brutal minutes. Jonas circled, struck, retreated, using the rocks and his knowledge of the terrain to stay out of reach of those deadly claws. He took a hit to his left arm that tore through his shirt and left 3 burning lines across his bicep, but he didn't slow down. Finally, when the bear reared up again, Jonas saw his opening. He lunged forward, driving the knife up under the bear's ribcage with all his strength, finding the heart with the precision of someone who knew animal anatomy better than most doctors knew human bodies. The grizzly collapsed, and Jonas staggered back, breathing hard, blood running down his arm. He cleaned his knife on the grass and began the work of skinning the animal. The pelt would bring good money in town, and the meat would feed families through the coming winter. He made it back to Nederland 2 days later, the massive bearskin draped over his pack horse. The town was little more than a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street built to support the silver mines that honeycombed the mountains. Jonas rode straight to the trading post, where old Walter Grimm would give him fair value for the pelt. What he didn't expect was the woman standing behind the counter. She was arranging jars of preserves on a shelf, her auburn hair pinned up in a practical bun, her dress a simple blue calico that somehow made her green eyes look like mountain lakes in summer. When she turned at the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, those eyes widened at the sight of him, 6 feet 3 inches of muscle and buckskin, dried blood on his torn shirt, his hair wild from days in the wilderness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite whatever she might have thought of his appearance. "Looking for Walter," Jonas said, suddenly aware of how rough he must look, how wild. "My uncle is visiting the assayer's office. I'm Catherine Grimm. I can help you with whatever you need." She moved toward the counter with easy confidence, and Jonas found himself tongue-tied for the first time in years. "Got a bearskin outside, prime grizzly." Her eyebrows rose. "The bear that's been causing trouble?" "The same." Catherine came around the counter and followed him outside, each where his pack horse stood with its heavy burden. She examined the pelt with a practiced eye, running her hand over the thick fur, checking the quality of his skinning work. "This is exceptional," she said. "Uncle Walter would offer you $40 for this. I'll give you 45. Jonas blinked. That was more than fair, more than generous. "Your uncle lets you make deals like that?" A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "My uncle knows I have a better eye for quality than he does. I've been working in trading posts since I was 15. I'm 23 now, and I know exactly what I'm doing." There was no arrogance in her tone, just simple confidence. Jonas found himself smiling back. 45 it is. As she helped him carry the heavy pelt inside and counted out his payment, Jonas learned that Catherine had come west from St. Louis 6 months earlier to help her uncle run the trading post. Her parents had died of cholera the previous year, and Walter was her only living relative. She spoke matter-of-factly about her circumstances, but Jonas heard the grief underneath the words. "You're the mountain man everyone talks about," she said as she wrapped his coins in paper. "They say you know these mountains better than anyone." "Been up here a long time," Jonas admitted. "These peaks are more home than any town ever was." It must be lonely. He met her eyes and found genuine curiosity there, not pity. Sometimes. But the mountains don't lie or cheat or betray. They're honest in their danger. Catherine handed him his payment, and their fingers brushed. Jonas felt something electric in that brief contact, something that made him want to linger in this cramped trading post instead of heading back to his cabin in the high country. "Will you be staying in town long?" she asked. "Few days. Need to stock up on supplies, get this arm looked at." He gestured to the bandage he'd wrapped around the bear's claw marks. "Let me see that." Before he could protest, Catherine had come around the counter and was examining his arm with gentle but firm hands. She unwrapped his crude bandage and clicked her tongue at what she found. "This needs to be cleaned properly and stitched. Come to the back room." Jonas followed her to a small room behind the main shop where she kept a medicine chest that would have impressed any frontier doctor. She heated water on a small stove, mixed some kind of antiseptic solution, and cleaned his wounds with careful efficiency. Her touch was gentle, but she didn't flinch at the sight of the deep gouges. "This is going to hurt," she warned, threading a needle with practiced ease. "I've had worse." She began stitching, and Jonas watched her face as she worked. There was a little furrow of concentration between her eyebrows, and she bit her lower lip when she was being especially careful. He found himself memorizing these details, storing them away like precious things. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My mother was a nurse during the war. She taught me before she died. Said every woman heading west should know how to treat wounds, because doctors are scarce and danger is plentiful." Catherine tied off the last stitch and bandaged his arm with clean cloth. "There. Just change that dressing every day and keep it clean. Come back in a week and I'll take the stitches out." "Thank you," Jonas said, and meant it with more depth than those simple words conveyed. Over the next 3 days, Jonas found excuses to visit the trading post. He needed coffee. He needed tobacco. He needed to ask about the price of new traps. Each time, Catherine greeted him with a knowing smile, as if she saw right through his transparent reasons for coming by. They talked while she worked, her hands always busy with some task while they learned each other's stories. Jonas told her about growing up in Missouri, how his parents had died in a barn fire when he was 16, how he'd headed west because there was nothing left for him in the settled lands. He talked about his first years in the mountains, was learning from an old French trapper named Baptiste, who had taught him everything about surviving in the high country. He didn't usually talk this much, but Catherine had a way of listening that made the words come easier. She told him about St. Louis, about her father's bookshop and her mother's work nursing the sick. She described how the cholera had come so fast, taking both her parents within a week of each other, leaving her alone in a city that suddenly felt empty and hostile. Uncle Walter's letter had arrived like a lifeline, offering her a place and a purpose in the wild mountains of Colorado Territory. "Do you like it here?" Jonas asked on the 3rd day, leaning against the counter while she inventoried a shipment of canned goods. Catherine paused, a can of peaches in her hand, and looked out the window at the mountains rising beyond the town. "I love it," she said softly. "It's hard and dangerous and nothing like what I knew before, but it feels real. Does that make sense? More sense than anything I've heard in a long time." She turned to look at him, and something shifted in the air between them. Jonas felt it like a physical thing, a pull stronger than gravity. He opened his mouth to say something, though he wasn't sure what, when the door burst open and a young boy ran in, breathless and wild-eyed. "Miss Grimm, Mr. Blackwood, there's been a collapse at the Lucky Jenny mine. They're trapped and they need help." Jonas was moving before the boy finished speaking, Catherine right behind him. They ran through the town to where a crowd had gathered at the mine entrance. The dust still hung in the air from the cave-in, and Jonas could hear the muffled shouts of trapped men beyond the wall of rock and timber that blocked the shaft. The mine foreman, a grizzled man named Hackett, was arguing with several miners. "We go in there now, we'll just cause another collapse. We need to shore up the entrance first." "Those men don't have time," one of the miners shouted back. Jonas pushed through the crowd and examined the situation. He'd seen cave-ins before, had helped dig out more than one trapped prospector. The entrance was partially collapsed, but there was a gap at the top, maybe 2 feet wide. Not big enough for most men, but possibly big enough for someone to squeeze through. "How many trapped?" he asked Hackett. 4 men. Been about 15 minutes since the collapse." Jonas studied the gap, or calculating angles and risks. "I can fit through there. Get me a rope and a lantern." "You'll bring the whole thing down," Hackett protested. "Maybe, but those men are dead for certain if we wait. Get me the rope." Catherine grabbed his arm. "Jonas, it's too dangerous." He looked down at her, saw the fear in her eyes, and felt something warm bloom in his chest at the realization that she was afraid for him. "I'll be careful," he said, covering her hand with his. They brought rope and a lantern, and Jonas tied the rope around his waist. He stripped off his shirt, needing to be as small as possible to fit through the gap. He heard Catherine's sharp intake of breath at the sight of his scarred torso, the muscles that stood out in sharp relief. He handed her his shirt without thinking, and she took it, clutching it against her chest. "Pull me out fast if you feel 3 hard tugs," he told the men holding the rope. Then he climbed into the gap. The space was tight, suffocatingly so. Jonas had to exhale completely to squeeze through, rocks scraping against his back and chest. He could feel the instability in the timbers above him, could hear the ominous creaking of wood and stone under pressure. He wormed forward inch by inch, the lantern light showing him the way. It took 5 minutes that felt like an hour to get through to the other side. He dropped into the shaft beyond and found the 4 trapped miners huddled against the far wall, covered in dust, one of them bleeding from a head wound. "Can you walk?" Jonas asked. "Yeah," the uninjured one said. The man with the head wound was dazed but mobile. "We have to go through single file. It's tight and it's unstable. No sudden moves, no panic. Understood?" They nodded, and Jonas led them back to the gap. He went through first, showing them how to position their bodies, how to breathe shallow and move slow. One by one, they squeezed through the narrow opening. The last man was halfway through when Jonas heard the sound he'd been dreading, a deep groan from the timbers above, followed by the rattle of shifting rock. "Pull!" he shouted to the men outside. "Pull now!" Hands grabbed the last miner and yanked him through as the roof began to fall. Jonas dove backward, felt the rope go taut around his waist, and then he was being dragged across the rocky ground as tons of stone and timber crashed down where he'd been standing seconds before. The entrance collapsed completely, dust billowing out in a choking cloud. When the dust cleared, Jonas found himself lying on his back outside the mine, coughing and bruised but alive. Catherine was there immediately, her hands on his face, his chest checking for injuries. "You insane, reckless, brave fool," she said, and there were tears streaming down her face even as she smiled at him. Jonas sat up and pulled her into his arms without thinking, driven by instinct and emotion. She came willingly, pressing her face against his dusty shoulder. He felt her trembling and held her tighter. "I'm all right," he murmured. "I'm all right." The crowd cheered, and the rescued miners clapped him on the back, but Jonas barely noticed. All he could focus on was the woman in his arms and the realization that he had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with her. That evening, after he'd washed the dust off and Catherine had insisted on checking his injuries again, they sat on the porch of the trading post and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The sky turned gold and crimson, painting the peaks in colors that took the breath away. "I've been thinking," Jonas said, not looking at her because this felt too important, too fragile, "about maybe building a cabin closer to town, still in the mountains but not so far away." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Why would you do that?" "Because I found something worth coming down from the high country for." He turned to look at her then, and found her watching him with those green eyes that had haunted his thoughts for 3 days and nights. "Because I met you, Catherine Grimm, and suddenly being alone in the mountains doesn't sound as good as it used to." She smiled, slow and warm. "Jonas Blackwood, are you courting me?" "I'm trying to, not sure I'm doing it right. It's been a while since I've tried to talk to a woman about anything other than trading furs." Catherine reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I think you're doing just fine." They sat there holding hands while the stars came out, and Jonas felt a peace he hadn't known in years. maybe ever. Over the following weeks, Jonas began the work of building a new cabin on a piece of land about 5 miles from Nederland, close enough to ride into town easily, but far enough up the mountain to still feel like home. It was hard work, felling trees and hauling stones, building the walls and chimney. But Catherine often rode out to visit him, bringing food and staying to help however she could. She learned that Jonas was a man of few words but deep feelings. He showed his care through actions, building the cabin extra sturdy because he was thinking of the future, hunting fresh meat and leaving it at the trading post for her and Walter, teaching her how to read the signs of changing weather in the mountains. And he listened when she talked, really listened, remembering every detail she shared about her dreams and hopes. Catherine showed Jonas a different kind of strength than he was used to. She could stitch wounds and balance ledgers and negotiate hard bargains with miners who thought they could cheat her. She could shoot a rifle and ride a horse, and knew 100 practical skills that came from growing up in a city, learning to be prepared for anything. But she was also soft in ways that made Jonas's heart ache, gentle with children and animals, quick to laugh, unafraid to cry when something moved her. They fell into a pattern of courtship that felt as natural as breathing. Jonas would come to town every few days, and they would walk together, talking or simply enjoying each other's presence. He taught her about the plants and animals of the mountains, showing her which berries were safe to eat and how to identify animal tracks. She taught him about books and poetry, reading to him in the evenings from the small library she'd brought from St. Louis. One evening in late July, Jonas brought her up to a meadow high above his new cabin where wildflowers grew in a riot of color. They sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley, watching the sunset paint the world in shades of amber and rose. "I used to think I understood beauty," Catherine said softly. "I thought I knew what it meant when I looked at paintings in museums or read descriptions in books. But this," she gestured at the mountains, the flowers, the endless sky. "This is something else entirely." Jonas looked at her instead of the view. "Yeah," he agreed, "it is." She caught him staring and blushed, but she didn't look away. "Jonas, I need to tell you something." His heart kicked against his ribs. "What?" "I'm falling in love with you. I think I have been since the day you walked into the trading post with that bearskin and looked at me like I was the most surprising thing you'd ever found in the mountains." She laughed a little nervously. "I know it's fast, and I know we're from different worlds, but I've never felt like this before, and I needed you to know." Jonas reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his palm rough and calloused against her smooth cheek. "Catherine, I killed that bear with just a knife and nerve because I've faced down every kind of danger these mountains can throw at a man. But the thought of not telling you how I feel, of losing you because I was too scared to speak up, that terrifies me more than any grizzly ever could. I love you. I've loved you since you bossed me into that back room and stitched up my arm like you'd known me for years instead of minutes." She turned her face into his palm and kissed it. Then she moved closer and kissed him properly. Jonas wrapped his arms around her and kissed her back with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks, and it felt like coming home to a place he'd been searching for his entire life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Catherine rested her forehead against his. "So what do we do now?" "We court properly," Jonas said. "We take our time and do this right. I'm building that cabin for us if you'll have it, and when it's finished, I'm going to ask you to marry me, Catherine Grimm." She laughed, bright and joyful. "I think I'll say yes, Jonas Blackwood." They rode back to town under the stars. Bess and Jonas left her at the trading post with one more kiss that left them both dizzy. He rode up to his half-finished cabin, feeling lighter than air, already planning the work he needed to do to make it worthy of her. But the mountains had taught Jonas that happiness was often hard-won and easily lost. 2 days later, Catherine was in the trading post when 3 men rode into town. They were rough-looking characters, the kind who wore their guns low and their intentions written plain on their faces. They tied their horses outside the saloon and went in for whiskey, and Catherine thought nothing of it until one of them came into the trading post an hour later. He was tall and thin, with a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, and his eyes swept over the shop with calculating interest. "Afternoon, miss." "Good afternoon. Can I help you find something?" "Maybe," He moved closer to the counter, too close, invading her space in a way that made her skin crawl. "You're Walter Grimm's niece, aren't you?" "I am." "Heard Grimm's got a safe in here. Heard he's been doing good business with all these miners around." Catherine's blood went cold, but she kept her voice level. "You heard wrong. Any money gets deposited with the bank. We don't keep cash here." The man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Now, I don't believe that. See, banks ask questions. Trading posts are more private. I think old Walter's been keeping his profits right here in this shop, and I think you're going to show me where. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I don't think so." He moved fast, coming around the counter and grabbing her arm. Catherine tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. "My friends and I need money for supplies. You're going to give it to us nice and peaceful, or things are going to get ugly." Catherine didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy jar of pickles from the shelf and smashed it into the side of his head. The man howled and released her, and Catherine ran for the back room where Walter kept his shotgun. She heard boots pounding behind her, felt hands grabbing at her dress. She screamed, loud and desperate, hoping someone would hear. Jonas was riding into town when he heard the scream. He knew Catherine's voice instantly, knew the terror in it, and he kicked his horse into a gallop. He reached the trading post in seconds, leaping from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. The scene inside made his vision go red. Catherine was struggling with a man who had her pinned against the counter, and two more men were coming through the door behind Jonas. He grabbed the one holding Catherine by the shoulder, spun him around, and hit him with a right cross that had all his weight and fury behind it. The man's head snapped back and he crumpled. The other two men went for their guns, but Jonas was faster. He drew his own pistol and fired, deliberately shooting low. One man screamed and fell, clutching his leg. The other froze, his hand on his holster. "Don't," Jonas said, his voice deadly calm. The man raised his hands and backed toward the door. We're going. "No, you're staying right here until the sheriff comes." Jonas kept his gun trained on the man while checking on Catherine with his eyes. "You all right?" She was shaking, but standing. "I'm all right, thank you." Walter came running from the bank, drawn by the gunshot, and several miners followed. The sheriff was summoned, and the three men were taken away in irons. The one Jonas had shot would lose his leg, the doctor said, but he'd live to stand trial. That night, Jonas wouldn't leave Catherine's side. Walter offered him a room above the trading post, and Jonas sat in a chair by Catherine's bed while she tried to sleep. Every time she woke, gasping from a nightmare, he was there, holding her hand and murmuring reassurances until she drifted off again. In the morning, Catherine came downstairs to find Jonas still in the chair, having not slept at all. She sat down beside him and took his hand. "You saved me," she said. "I'll always save you," Jonas replied, "long as there's breath in my body. Nothing's going to hurt you." Catherine leaned against his shoulder. "I was so scared, not just for me, but that something would happen before I could tell you again that I love you, that we'd lose our chance at a life together." Jonas turned to face her, both his hands holding hers now. "We're not losing anything. That cabin's almost done, Catherine. Another month and it'll be ready. Come up there with me today. Let me show you what I'm building for us." So Catherine told Walter she needed a day away from the trading post, and she rode up the mountain with Jonas to see the cabin he'd been working on for weeks. It sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a view down the valley that stole her breath. The cabin was bigger than she'd expected, built from sturdy logs chinked with mud and moss. Jonas had made the windows large to let in light, and he'd constructed a wide porch where they could sit and watch the mountains. Inside, he'd built furniture with his own hands, a table and chairs, a bed frame, shelves and cabinets. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, big enough to keep the cabin warm through the brutal mountain winters. He'd even started carving decorative touches into the wood, simple but beautiful patterns that showed the care he was putting into every detail. "Jonas, it's perfect," Catherine breathed, running her hand along the smooth wood of the table. "Not done yet. Need to finish the loft, and I want to build a proper larder off the back for storing food, and I'm going to dig a root cellar before winter comes." He was watching her anxiously, looking for approval. "You really like it?" "I love it. I can see us living here, growing old here together." Jonas smiled, and Catherine saw relief and happiness wash over his rugged features. They spent the day at the cabin, with Catherine suggesting little touches and Jonas showing her his plans for expanding the property. He wanted to build a stable for horses, maybe get some chickens and a milk cow. He talked about planting a garden next spring, about hunting enough meat to last through the winters, about the life they could build together in this beautiful, isolated place. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch steps together. Catherine rested her head on Jonas's shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her. "I could live up here," she said, "away from town, just us in the mountains. I thought I'd miss civilization, but I don't think I would." "Not with you." "You'd get lonely," Jonas said. "It's one thing to visit for a day. It's another to be up here when the snows come and you don't see another soul for weeks." "I'd have you." "Yeah, you would." He kissed the top of her head. "We'll make it work. You can keep helping Walter with the trading post and I'll keep trapping and hunting. We'll have the best of both worlds." Over the following weeks, Jonas finished the cabin while Catherine prepared for their life together. She bought fabric and sewed curtains for the windows. She collected supplies, dishes and pots, blankets and linens, all the small things that would turn the cabin into a home. Walter gave them a cast-iron stove as an early wedding present, and several miners helped Jonas haul it up the mountain and install it. The town had embraced their romance. Everyone knew the story of the mountain man and the trading post girl, how he'd saved her from those outlaws, how he was building a cabin for her with his own hands. Women stopped Catherine on the street to share advice about married life. Men clapped Jonas on the back and made jokes about him being tamed by a pretty girl from St. Louis. Jonas took it all with good humor, but in private, he told Catherine, "They don't understand. You didn't tame me. You made me want something I didn't know I was missing." August turned to September, and the aspens began to turn gold on the mountainsides. The cabin was finished, beautiful and sturdy and ready for them. Jonas had one more thing he needed to do. He rode down to the trading post on a crisp morning when the air smelled of autumn and smoke from the town's chimneys. Catherine was outside hanging herbs to dry, and she smiled when she saw him. "Good morning. I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." "Couldn't wait." Jonas dismounted and suddenly found himself nervous in a way he hadn't been since the first day he met her. "Catherine, come with me. There's something I want to show you." She untied her apron and let him help her onto his horse. They rode out of town toward the cabin, but Jonas stopped at the meadow where they had first told each other they were falling in love. The wildflowers had faded with the changing season, but the view was still breathtaking, the mountains dusted with the first snow of the season on their highest peaks. Jonas helped Catherine down from the horse, and he led her to the flat rock where they'd sat before. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs, but his hands were steady as he took both of hers. "Catherine Grimm, I've spent most of my adult life alone in these mountains. I thought that was what I wanted, what I needed. I thought other people would just complicate things, make life harder than it needed to be. And then I met you, and everything changed." He took a deep breath. "You make me want to be better, do better. You make me want a future instead of just surviving day to day. I love you more than I have words to say, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you how much." Jonas released her hands and dropped to one knee on the rocky ground. He pulled a small box from his pocket, handmade from pine and polished smooth. Inside was a ring he'd crafted himself, and a hammering and shaping a gold coin into a band, setting into it a small sapphire he'd traded for with a jeweler in Denver. "Will you marry me?" he asked, looking up at her with his heart in his eyes. Catherine had tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling brighter than the sun. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Jonas, of course I'll marry you." He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms, and they were kissing and laughing and crying all at once. Jonas lifted her off her feet and spun her around, and Catherine threw her head back and whooped with joy, the sound echoing off the mountains. "When?" she asked when he finally set her down. "Soon as you want. Tomorrow, if you'll have me that fast." Catherine laughed. "Give me 2 weeks. I want to make a proper dress. And we need to arrange for a minister to come from Denver. But not longer than 2 weeks, Jonas Blackwood. I've waited long enough for my life with you to start." They rode back to town with Catherine sitting in front of Jonas on the horse, his arms around her waist, her head resting back against his chest. When they reached the trading post, Walter came out and took one look at their faces and grinned. "About time, you fool mountain man. I've been wondering when you'd get around to asking her properly." "I did it properly," Jonas protested. "Went down on one knee and everything." "He was perfect," Catherine said, showing her uncle the ring. "Look what he made me." Walter examined the ring and nodded approvingly. "Good work. You've got more skill than I gave you credit for." He clapped Jonas on the shoulder. You take care of my niece, you hear? She's all the family I've got." "I'll guard her with my life," Jonas said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The next 2 weeks were a flurry of activity. Catherine made her wedding dress from white muslin, sewing lace around the collar and cuffs. The women of the town helped her, offering their own lace and ribbons, sharing patterns and advice. Jonas had a suit made by the town tailor, black wool that made him look uncomfortable but handsome. He got his hair cut shorter than it had been in years, though it still fell to his shoulders, and he shaved his beard into a neat mustache. Walter arranged for a circuit preacher to come through town on the right day, and the whole town prepared for the wedding. It would be held outside, on the main street of Nederland, because the small church building couldn't hold everyone who wanted to attend. The miners decorated the street with lanterns and late-blooming wildflowers. The saloon-keeper donated whiskey for a toast, and the women organized a potluck dinner. The night before the wedding, Jonas stayed at the cabin alone, as tradition dictated. He lay in the bed he'd built and stared at the ceiling, thinking about how his life was about to change. There was no fear in him, no doubts, only anticipation and a deep, abiding joy that he'd found the woman he was meant to spend his life with. Catherine spent that night at the trading post, unable to sleep from excitement. She kept getting up to look at her dress hanging on the wardrobe door, touching the ring on her finger to make sure it was real and not some beautiful dream. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, the sky a flawless blue, the air crisp with autumn's chill. Jonas rode into town early and found half the population already up and preparing. Someone had built an arch of pine boughs and flowers at one end of the street, and chairs had been set up in rows for the guests. Jonas stood under the arch in his new suit, feeling like his collar might strangle him, and waited. Walter stood beside him as his best man, and the preacher held his Bible ready. The town filled with people, miners and merchants and families, everyone dressed in their best clothes. Then Catherine appeared at the other end of the street, and Jonas forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. Her dress was simple but elegant, the white fabric catching the light, the lace at her throat delicate as frost. Her auburn hair was pinned up with small white flowers woven through it, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming columbines. But it was her face that held Jonas captivated, the pure joy shining in her eyes as she walked toward him. Walter escorted her down the aisle between the chairs, and when they reached the arch, he kissed Catherine's cheek and placed her hand in Jonas's. Jonas held on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. The preacher began to speak, reading verses about love and commitment, but Jonas barely heard the words. He was looking at Catherine, memorizing every detail of this moment, the way her hand trembled slightly in his, the way she couldn't stop smiling, the way her eyes never left his face. When it came time for vows, Jonas spoke clearly, his deep voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "I, Jonas Blackwood, take you, Catherine Grimm, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to build you a good home and a good life. I promise to be worthy of the gift you've given me by choosing me." Catherine's voice shook with emotion as she replied, "I, Catherine Grimm, take you, Jonas Blackwood, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, stand beside you, and support you for all the days of my life. I promise to make our house a home. I promise to be worthy of the love and protection you offer me so freely." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Jonas kissed his bride, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Jonas lifted Catherine off her feet again, kissing her thoroughly while the town celebrated around them. The feast that followed was the best meal most of the miners had seen in months. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted venison and elk, fresh bread, pies made from canned fruits and wild berries, vegetables from the late gardens. Someone produced a fiddle, and someone else had a harmonica, and soon there was music and dancing in the street. Jonas danced with his wife, holding her close and swaying to the music, even though he'd never been much of a dancer. Catherine laughed and taught him the steps, and he followed her lead, marveling that this woman was now his, that he got to hold her like this for the rest of their lives. As the sun began to set, Jonas and Catherine slipped away from the party. They rode up to the cabin together, while Catherine, sitting sideways in the saddle in her wedding dress, Jonas's arm around her to keep her secure. The mountains were painted gold and crimson by the setting sun, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. When they reached the cabin, Jonas dismounted and lifted Catherine down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her to the door and over the threshold. Inside, the cabin was warm from the fire someone had laid in the hearth earlier, and the lamps were lit, casting a soft glow over everything. Jonas set Catherine down gently, and they stood looking at each other in the firelight. He reached up and carefully removed the pins from her hair, letting it fall in waves around her shoulders. She unbuttoned his collar, freeing him from the constriction of the formal shirt. "Hello, husband," she said softly. "Hello, wife," Jonas replied, and pulled her into his arms. They made love for the first time in the bed Jonas had built with his own hands, learning each other with tenderness and passion. Catherine traced the scars on Jonas's body, each one a story of survival and struggle, and Jonas worshipped every inch of her skin as if she were something sacred. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but inside the cabin, two lives became irrevocably intertwined. The first months of their marriage were blissfully happy. They settled into the rhythms of mountain life together, with Jonas teaching Catherine everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the wilderness. She learned to read animal tracks and predict weather changes. She learned which plants were edible and which were poisonous. And she learned to shoot with deadly accuracy and to skin the rabbits and squirrels she brought down. Catherine brought her own skills to their partnership. She organized their supplies with ruthless efficiency, ensuring they'd have everything they needed for the long winter ahead. She cooked meals that were far better than anything Jonas had made for himself in his years alone. She kept their clothes mended and their home clean, and she did it all without complaint, finding joy in the work of building a life together. Jonas continued to trap and hunt, but he never went far from the cabin for long. He couldn't stand to be away from Catherine for more than a few days, and she felt the same. On the rare occasions when she went down to town to help Walter at the trading post, Jonas would ride down in the evening to bring her home, unable to sleep without her beside him. Winter came early that year, with heavy snows by late October. The cabin proved its worth, staying warm and dry even when the wind howled down from the peaks and the snow piled up past the windows. Jonas and Catherine spent long evenings by the fire, with her reading aloud from her books while he carved or worked on repairing equipment. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies with growing confidence and passion. Jonas was endlessly gentle with Catherine, always careful of his strength, but she urged him to let go of his control, assuring him she wouldn't break. Their passion was matched only by their tenderness, the way they held each other afterward, talking softly until sleep claimed them. In February, Catherine began feeling ill in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she'd eaten, but when the nausea continued for a week, she realized what it meant. She waited to tell Jonas until she was certain, not wanting to raise his hopes only to disappoint him. Jonas came in from checking his trap lines one afternoon to find Catherine sitting at the table with an odd expression on her face, something between excitement and nervousness. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. "Nothing's wrong." Catherine took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Jonas, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." Jonas stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. Then a smile broke across his face like sunrise, transforming his rugged features. He laughed, loud and joyful, and scooped Catherine into his arms. "A baby," he repeated. "We're having a baby." He set her down carefully, suddenly worried he'd been too rough. "Are you all right? Do you need anything? Should we get the doctor?" Catherine laughed at his instant transformation into an overprotective husband. "I'm fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. But yes, we should have the doctor come up and check on me, just to make sure everything's progressing as it should." The next months were a revelation for Jonas. He watched Catherine's body change, her belly swelling with their child, and he was overcome with a protectiveness that bordered on obsessive. He barely let her lift anything heavy. He insisted on doing all the chores that required bending or stretching. When she wanted to ride down to town to see Walter, Jonas wouldn't let her go unless he accompanied her. And then he worried the whole time about the ride being too rough. Catherine tolerated his hovering with good humor, though she occasionally had to remind him that she was pregnant, not made of glass. "Women out here work until the day they give birth," she pointed out. "I'm not going to sit around doing nothing for 9 months." Still, she secretly loved his attentiveness, the way he would rest his hand on her belly to feel the baby kick, the way he talked to the child as if it could already hear him. Jonas built a cradle from pine, sanding it smooth and carving protective symbols into the wood. He hunted extra meat and worked longer hours to stockpile everything they might need. Summer came, and Catherine grew large and uncomfortable in the heat. Jonas rigged a shade on the porch where she could sit and catch the breeze, and he brought her cold water from the stream. At night, he rubbed her aching back and feet, marveling at the life they'd created together. In early August, Catherine's labor began. Jonas rode like the devil was chasing him to fetch the doctor from Netherland, and he paced the cabin like a caged animal, while the doctor and 2 women from town helped Catherine through the birth. The sound of her pain nearly drove him mad, but she'd forbidden him from the room, insisting that he'd only get in the way. After 8 hours that felt like a lifetime, Jonas heard the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn. The doctor opened the door and grinned at him. "You have a son, Blackwood, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing fine." Jonas pushed past him into the bedroom. Catherine lay propped up against the pillows, just exhausted and sweaty and more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket, and when Jonas approached, she pulled back the fabric to show him. His son had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes were squeezed shut as he wailed his displeasure at being born. Jonas reached out with one trembling finger and touched the baby's impossibly small hand. Tiny fingers wrapped around his, gripping with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Jonas whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Catherine, he's perfect. Do you want to hold him?" Jonas nodded, not trusting his voice, and Catherine carefully transferred the baby to his arms. Jonas had held many things in his life, had carried heavy packs through mountain passes and wrestled with wild animals. But nothing had ever felt as precious and terrifying as the weight of his son in his arms. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your papa. I've been waiting to meet you." The baby stopped crying and seemed to look up at him, though Jonas knew newborns couldn't really see yet. Still, he felt a connection snap into place, a love so fierce and overwhelming that it brought tears to his eyes. "What should we name him?" Catherine asked. Jonas thought for a moment, looking down at his son. "William, after my father. William Jonas Blackwood." "William," Catherine repeated, smiling. "It's perfect." The doctor and the women left, and Jonas climbed carefully into bed beside Catherine, still holding William. They lay there together, a family of 3 now, watching their son sleep. "I never knew I could feel like this," Jonas said. "Like my heart's going to burst from loving you both so much." Catherine rested her head on his shoulder. "We made him, Jonas. This perfect little person is part of you and part of me. It's a miracle." The early days of parenthood were exhausting but joyful. William was a healthy baby with powerful lungs and a strong appetite. Catherine nursed him while Jonas hovered nearby, ready to help with anything she needed. He changed diapers without complaint and walked the floor with William when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in his rough voice until William settled. Walter came up from town regularly to visit his great-nephew, and he brought gifts: a silver rattle, tiny clothes, a toy horse carved from wood. The town had embraced William as their own, with miners stopping by to awkwardly coo over the baby and offer rough congratulations to the proud parents. As William grew from infant to baby to toddler, Jonas watched in amazement. This child who carried his blood was fearless and curious, constantly getting into trouble. William learned to walk early, and then Jonas and Catherine spent all their time chasing after him, pulling him back from the fire or catching him before he tumbled down the porch steps. "He's going to be a handful," Catherine said one evening, watching William determinedly try to climb onto the table. "He's a Blackwood," Jonas replied with pride. "We're all stubborn as mules." The years passed in a blur of happiness. William grew into a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Was he equally comfortable helping Jonas check traps or sitting quietly while Catherine taught him his letters? They had two more children in the following years. A daughter they named Sarah, who was gentle and thoughtful, and another son they named Thomas, who was wild and mischievous. The cabin grew with their family. Jonas added rooms, expanding the structure until it was more house than cabin. He built a proper barn and acquired horses, chickens, a milk cow, and a pair of goats. Catherine planted a large garden, and the children helped her tend it, learning responsibility and the value of hard work. Jonas still hunted and trapped, but now he did it with William at his side, teaching his son everything Baptiste had once taught him. He showed William how to read the forest, how to move silently, how to respect the animals they hunted. He told him stories of the old days, of fighting the grizzly with just a knife, of meeting Catherine and knowing instantly that his life was about to change. Catherine continued to help Walter at the trading post occasionally, bringing the children with her so they could learn about business and commerce. She taught them reading and arithmetic, history and geography, using the books she'd brought from St. Louis and new ones they ordered from Denver. She wanted her children to be educated, to have choices about their futures that she and Jonas had never had. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jonas took Catherine back to the meadow where he'd proposed. The children were staying with Walter for the night, giving them rare time alone together. They sat on the same flat rock, now watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar gold and crimson. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked. "Giving up city life to live in the mountains with a rough mountain man?" Catherine looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Regret it?" "Jonas, you gave me everything I ever wanted. A life full of purpose and meaning, children I adore, a home I love. And you." She cupped his face in her hands. "Especially you. Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." Jonas kissed her softly, then more deeply, and they made love on the mountainside under the stars like they had as newlyweds, their passion undiminished by a decade of marriage. More years passed, and Jonas began to teach William not just survival skills, but the deeper knowledge of the mountains. He showed his son the sacred places, the secret valleys where elk gathered in winter, the caves where bears hibernated. He taught William to hunt bear, as he once had, though he insisted his son carry a rifle as backup to the knife. When William was 17, a massive grizzly began terrorizing the area, killing livestock and threatening the town. Jonas and William tracked it together, and when they cornered it, Jonas stepped back and let his son take the lead. He watched with pride as William approached the bear with the same courage and nerve Jonas had once shown, using skill and intelligence to avoid the deadly claws while getting close enough for a kill shot. When it was over and the bear lay dead, William looked at his father with shining eyes. "I did it." "You did," Jonas agreed, pulling his son into a fierce hug. "You've become a man I'm proud to call my son." Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's intelligence and her father's strength. She had no interest in hunting or trapping, but she could outride most men and had a talent for healing that reminded Jonas of Catherine's skill with medicine. She talked about becoming a nurse, maybe even a doctor if she could find a medical school that would accept a woman. Thomas was the wild one, always pushing boundaries and getting into scrapes. He reminded Jonas of himself at that age, full of restless energy and a need to test himself against the world. Jonas recognized that Thomas would need to leave the mountains someday to find his own path, and he made peace with it, even as his heart ached at the thought. Walter died peacefully in his sleep when Jonas was 45. They buried him on a hillside overlooking Nederland, and Catherine wept for the uncle who had given her a home when she had nothing. Jonas held her while she cried, and promised that they'd take care of the trading post, keep it running in Walter's memory. The trading post became Sarah's domain. She took over its management with enthusiasm, expanding the inventory and improving the accounting systems. She turned it into the most successful business in Nederland, and Jonas watched with amazement as his gentle daughter proved herself a shrewd businesswoman. William married a local girl and built his own cabin further up the mountain. He and his wife gave Jonas and Catherine their first grandchildren, two boys who were as wild and fearless as their grandfather had been. Jonas taught them to track and hunt, on passing on the knowledge that Baptiste had given him so many years ago. Thomas left for Denver when he was 19, drawn by the growing city and opportunities his small mountain town couldn't provide. Jonas and Catherine worried, but let him go, knowing he needed to find his own way. He wrote letters regularly, telling them about his work with the railroad and the city girl he was courting. Sarah fell in love with the new doctor who came to Netherland, a serious young man from Boston who had come west seeking adventure. They married in the same spot where Jonas and Catherine had wed, and Jonas walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the day he'd stood under that pine arch and watched Catherine walk toward him. Time moved on, relentless and beautiful. Jonas's hair turned gray, then white, and his body began to slow down in ways that frustrated him. Catherine developed arthritis in her hands that made sewing difficult, and she wore spectacles to read. But they were still deeply in love, still reaching for each other in the night, still finding joy in simple things like watching the sunset together or playing with their grandchildren. On a spring morning in 1906, when Jonas was 58 and Catherine was 53, they walked together up to the meadow where Jonas had proposed 30 years earlier. It had become their tradition to visit this spot on their anniversary, to remember who they had been and celebrate who they'd become. They sat on the flat rock, holding hands and watching the mountains. The wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the meadow in rainbows of color. 30 years, Catherine said wonderingly. It feels like a lifetime and like no time at all. Best 30 years of my life, Jonas replied. You know, I used to think I was complete by myself up here in the mountains. I thought I didn't need anyone or anything else. I was such a fool. Catherine laughed. You weren't a fool. You just hadn't met me yet. True enough. Jonas turned to look at her, seeing the woman he'd fallen in love with underneath the lines time had etched on her face. Catherine Blackwood, you made me whole. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to build instead of just survive. You took a rough mountain man who didn't know how to talk to people and taught him how to love. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. So would I. Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder, perfectly content. Every adventure, every challenge, every moment of joy and sorrow. I'd choose it all again if it meant choosing you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their mountains change in the shifting light. Around them, the land they'd built their life on continued its eternal dance of seasons. Below, the cabin that Jonas had constructed with his own hands stood strong, filled now with the sounds of grandchildren playing. Sarah was probably at the trading post, managing the day's business. William was likely out on the trap lines with his sons. Thomas would be working in Denver, building his life in the growing city. It was a good life, a full life, the kind of life Jonas had never imagined possible that morning when he'd tracked a grizzly with nothing but a knife and nerve. He'd been brave facing down that bear, but kneeling softly to propose to Catherine had taken a different kind of courage. It had required him to open his heart, to make himself vulnerable, to trust in something more powerful than any wild animal. And she had said yes, and together they had built something beautiful. Jonas kissed his wife's temple and pulled her closer. Come on, Mrs. Blackwood, let's head home. I believe there are grandchildren waiting who want me to tell them the story of how their grandfather fought a bear. Catherine smiled. Make sure you tell them the whole story this time, about how you knelt in this very meadow and asked me to marry you. That's the best part of the story, Jonas agreed. They stood together, moving a bit slower than they once had, but still strong, still together. Hand in hand, they walked down from the meadow toward the home they'd built, toward the family they'd created, toward the life they'd chosen. The mountains stood eternal around them, witness to their love story, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold. Behind them, the meadow would wait for another anniversary, another visit, another celebration of the love between a mountain man who'd hunted bear with a knife and nerve, and the woman who'd taught him that. The softest moments, the times when he knelt with his heart in his hands, were often the bravest moments of all. Their story would be told for generations in Netherland, passed down through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The story of Jonas Blackwood, who'd fought a grizzly with nothing but a blade and courage, who'd saved a woman from outlaws, who'd built a life and a legacy in the unforgiving mountains. But most of all, They'd remember how he loved Catherine Grimm with a fierce devotion that lasted a lifetime, how he'd knelt softly to propose, and then spent the rest of his life standing strong beside her, proving every day that the greatest adventure wasn't surviving the wilderness, but building a life with the person you loved. And in the end, when their time in the mountains was done, and they were laid to rest side by side on a hillside overlooking their beloved valley, everyone who knew them agreed that theirs had been a true love story, the kind that only comes along once in a lifetime, the kind that changes the very land it touched. The cabin Jonas built still stood a century later, maintained by descendants who knew the story of its construction, who knew that every log and stone had been placed with love and hope for the future. But for now, on this perfect spring evening, Jonas and Catherine walked home together through their mountains, their hands clasped, their hearts full, their love as strong and enduring as the peaks around them. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. That they had found each other in the vast wilderness of life, that they had chosen love over fear, that they had built something lasting and true. The mountain man who'd hunted bear with a knife and nerve had found something more valuable than any pelt, more precious than any gold strike. He'd found love, and he'd had the wisdom and courage to kneel softly when he proposed to the woman who would become his whole world. And she had taken his scarred, calloused hand and walked beside him through 3 decades of joy and sorrow, adventure and peace, building a family and a legacy that would outlast them both. The end.